when you think of modern action figure prototypes, it's modern is a funny term because this goes back now 27 years. So this era of prototype collecting is a vast one and has an immense interest at this point. And we are fortunate to have some of the world's experts on and who have some amazing collections they're going to share with you. So I want to introduce to you Brandon Weiss, Elling Hogue, Don Henderson.
Excellent. Thanks, Gus. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy celebration schedule to attend our presentation. We've got some great content and amazing images to share with you guys. So for introductions, I'm Elling. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I've been a Star Wars collector for over 30 years now. Fortunately, I haven't aged today, so it's great. My areas of interest, these days are mainly vintage Canadian production items and prototypes, both modern and vintage.
I'm Don Henderson. I've been doing this since Power of the Force 2 came out, got back into it, and kept meeting up with Brandon in Walmart's hunting for Power of the Force 2 figures. And next thing you know, we're talking about prototypes and stuff like that back then, and really got into it. I focus on, I like Tusken Raider. I love Sebulba, which you'll probably see in the presentation, and Imperial Gunner stuff.
I'm Brandon Weiss from Phoenix, Arizona. Both Don and I, as you heard, we're both from Arizona. Been collecting since probably 1995. Started off as a kid collecting the toys, and 13 years old, my dog chewed up my blue snaggletooth. I had to get out of it. Back then, there were no ways to get action figures back there. No eBay, all of that. So fast forwarding to today, my interests, are pre-production modern prototypes. I also host a website called prototypearchives.com, featuring a lot of unproduced modern Star Wars toys. Apologize for my voice being a little hoarse, doing a lot of talking over the weekend. So thank you for attending our panel today.
Yeah, and in addition, before we really get started here, we acknowledge that there's a lot of great collectors in the community, very focused on modern prototypes and stuff like that. But one person that really stands out is a longtime collector, Anthony Pagano. Unfortunately, with the changing celebration dates, he wasn't able to be here as a co-presenter, but don't feel too bad. He is presently in Hawaii with his family, so... But seriously, Anthony has been a true inspiration and an incredible source of knowledge for modern prototypes in the community for decades. I spent countless hours researching, tracking down employees, getting information from them. So, thank you, Anthony. Wish you were here. So our presentation will cover three main areas of the creation of an action figure. The first one, overall product conceptualization, and sort of the second phase, the creation of the figure itself, and then development of the packaging. Plus, at the very end, we're going to have a special treat to wrap things up. We have amazing material for unproduced items that we've been able to identify over the years, more specifically Brandon, as one of his true areas of passion in the modern prototypes. Also, just to preface the presentation, we'll mainly be focused on sort of the modern area, as Gus described. It's kind of fuzzy terminology at times, but for a lot of this, 1995 up to say roughly 2015. Over the years from the vintage era into modern, there are changes in technology in terms of methodologies for creating figures, packaging, design. Everything has become very, computer generated these days. So we acknowledge that there are variations from one manufacturer to another, from one shop to another, one designer to another. So what we're providing is just sort of that high-level understanding of the process and where things go. So the development of an action figure is a very involved process. There's safety guidelines, quality control, brand consistency, cost control, marketability. We won't get into it, but funny little things like, how many accessories for an action figure will we include? I mean, it comes down to like tenth of a penny kind of thing. How much does that equate to? So, it's all, highly intricate, heavily controlled, But each stage in the production, is critical both for the licensor and the licensee, and requires, specific features to be reviewed and approved. So how does it all start? The idea, where does it come from? Maybe it's something that's been fully fleshed out, in someone's mind. They've been thinking about it for years. Perhaps it's, something less tangible, just in the back of their mind. Maybe the inspiration comes from like an irregular shaped potato chip that they've pulled out of the bag, right? So ultimately, the development of an action figure involves, the generation and screening of that new idea. So as we know, the Star Wars universe is, incredibly diverse, continually evolving. Changes to a figure can occur at any time. Today, in the sort of the modern area, but also in the vintage times, it could be just a portion of a figure design or a concept that's provided to like a sculptor or designer. And from there could be changes that occur because they have to extrapolate and use their own creative inspiration to figure things out. An example of the vintage area, as Brandon mentioned, the blue snaggletooth figure. That was an early design. Kenner essentially had the upper portion of the figure and put long legs on them. And in the end, the design of the figure was supposed to have these stubby little legs. So, we had that running change back then. And we see the same thing in other figures today, where it looks like the figure could be, have a long tail, but from an action figure creation perspective, it makes more sense to have legs on them. So.
Okay, we'll jump right in here on one of the earlier things that happened with the action figure. We got various photos that are supplied by Lucasfilms to Hasbro, so they could sculpt based on the accurate likenesses of the characters. In this case, the variety of photos are printed on ordinary paper in a color format, which is probably even costly to do back in the mid-90s. And it's interesting to see some of the behind-the-scenes looks, like the Leia Bespin in the center of the bunch, where they're kind of like, production photos behind the scenes. They're taking all different kinds of angles of the character, so they can get the best things to sculpt with. These particular photos were supplied for the creation of the Buddies line, but they are a good representation of the kind of stuff that's supplied to start the sculpting process. Moving on to the middle is some reference photos for the Epic Force line, and I don't know if it's easy to see or not. At the bottom it has a note on there, Epic Force line. And the production lay on the left, you can see how closely it matches the actual photo from the movie. And then those photos were actually used on the back of the box, which are the back of the box photos are on the right side. So they actually used them as reference photos and then ended up using the actual photos on the box, which is kind of neat. Moving into like episode 1, this is these battle bags. They didn't really make the cut too much, but this is kind of interesting in the design process in that they were looking at creating some characters based on the chessboard pieces, and these are original pieces of artwork that were created based on the chessboard characters that were ultimately canceled because the battle bags didn't make it past the first series. But I think ultimately those would have been some really cool characters if they had put those together. Next, we have some presentation boards, which are pretty cool. The Stormtrooper board was used in presentation for the initial Buddies Plush release, but it's still cool to see here because it contains so many different pieces of interesting design features. On the left side, you can see it contains color Pantone swatches for all the needed colors that were going to be used on the Stormtrooper had they made one. The bottom has flat sample fabric with patterns, and the center photo is a hand-drawn picture of the Stormtrooper with a color overlay on like a real thin paper. And then on the right side, you see those Stormtrooper reference photos that they used. So they would have used this board in a presentation meeting to talk about creating this Tusken, this is my favorite, this Stormtrooper plush at some point. And then on the right side, we have the Power of the Jedi catwall, which would have been from the special edition release of the movie. And you have some internal reference photos taken behind the scenes of the puppet with a hand sketch of the figure. Ultimately, the release figure was quite different. It actually had fake legs hidden under its cloak, if you recall. And so it's kind of interesting where they started with it and how they ended up with the production one in the end.
Yeah, so for the actual figure itself, the 3D figure, there's sort of 5 main steps for that. You have the sculpt, which is a 3D representation of the figure, and then they make a silicon mold from that, which creates a negative cavity, a negative image of the figure. From there, they'll use that silicon mold, pour in resin to create another positive hard copy, something that's more durable that they can work with, perhaps paint, further modify and change. And then there's the production mold, which is, heavy, high industrial steel, something that can really withstand a lot of use. And then from that, they're able to output the figure, which would be sort of a first shot, and that is your final sort of stage of the figure. Plastic, articulated perhaps. So getting into the sculpting side of things, to get that first stage going, input drawings. As Don pointed out, you have conceptual drawings, but input drawings, it could be movie references, they could be sketches that designers put together, but some sort of drawing, typically, again, early stage. Pattern drawing, something that would provide a higher level of detail. Rough clay would be the sort of the first crack at making that 3D figure. Something very rough, typically not articulated, just something they could use to sort of get the general shape and size, perhaps, and some of the specific features of the character. And then on to wax sculpt, and you typically get like a preliminary and a final wax, or even just a modification of that wax over time to end up with a final. So here we have an example of an input drawing. This one would be referred to as a turnaround, because you essentially have the front of the figure, 90 degrees, so you can see the profile of the figure, and then the back of the figure. Breakaways to show the details on the arm and stuff like that. Other input drawings, could be like this. These ones here are for the Clone Wars series, and they're ones on the left there are Count Dooku, and only part of the figure is included. And the reason for that is that they weren't essentially going to, re-engineer the entire figure. This would have been just a modification, sort of the second version of the Clone Wars figure. So, and if you look very closely, you can actually see in the joints, in the shoulder, in the arms, the knees, the hips, and everything like that, exactly what type of pinning, feature that'll have in terms of what creates the articulation for the figure. So is it going to be a ball joint? Is it going to be just a rotational point? So even things like that are considered and designed right from the beginning. Obi-Wan has a good example there. It really just shows his hip even or his waist, the pelvis, where he's going to rotate, and just that one rotational point. A significant change from what we had in the past. The vintage area, again, just for the most part, 5 points of articulation, right? You got the neck, both arms, and both legs. And we still get that a little bit today with some of the introductory or basic level action figures, but most of them now, they've gone to being very highly articulated. And again, it's all something that's heavily considered at the beginning. Here we have an example of pattern drawings. Some figures like Queen Amidala, highly intricate, lots of detail, whether it's the wardrobe, whether it's the hair, all that type of thing. And all these things, again, need to be finely documented, detailed, reviewed, modified in order to get to that final end. And just as if you were, designing a house or engineering a product, for an assembly line, it's the same general steps for an action figure as well. How many pieces are there, and what's involved with each one. Then you get into the clay roughs, as a collectible or just as an item in general. These are extremely difficult to come by. The clay, it dries out. It does not really survive the test of time. So to find images of these pieces, for that time or still intact is a very, very huge accomplishment. On the left, it's the Boba Fett from the Applause line. So not 3 3/4 inch scale, but again, it's so tough to find a clay rough of any figure that you kind of just have to pick examples wherever you can get them. On the right is the Power of the Force 2 speeder bike pilot. So again, very, very challenging to find these pieces. And here we have a nice example, sort of a comparison. On the left is the clay rough for the Sebulba figure, one of Dawn's favorites. Again, if you look very closely, you can see that there's no articulation for the figure, in terms of the legs or arms or anything like that. Even the design of the figure, you can see his toes and his fingers are a little bit different than what they ultimately, released as the final product of the figure. And then on the right is the presentation board that would have been used sort of cooperatively to create this figure to get to that clay rough. And moving on, final wax sculpt. Again, we have a few examples of a figure, whether they have soft goods or rigid, clothing, that type of thing. So on the left, Stacey Tin there, that's his robe. And depending on the line, sometimes the figures will be released with rigid, cloth items, clothing, and other times, over the years, they changed them and created the soft goods approach. So, but regardless, if there's a soft goods piece, that would have to be sculpted separately from what the hips and the legs would be underneath, because both those pieces would have to be produced, completely separate. And then on the right, a full, complete 3/4 inch figure from the original trilogy line. Again, to find something like this an image of this is extremely challenging. So, next up, a few more wax sculpts. Boba Fett from the Applause line. Again, this one is the same Boba Fett that we saw 2 slides ago, and this one here would be the wax versus the clay rough that we saw before. And then on the right, Boba Fett, the 12-inch series, and that's the sculpt for his helmet. So, very intricate detail for these things, because during the production process, you lose detail with every step as you move forward. So, starting off with as much detail as possible is extremely important. So.
Moving on, we come up with some silicon molds for the Power Jedi line, and the first one on the left is for the Vader head, for the one that has the Luke face in it. I forget which figure that's called, but you can see in the mold, it's cool where they put it together and how it's poured in the resin to create the hard copies on that. And it's much bigger mold than the right one, which has for the Luke X-Wing figure, which is more sculpted really closely to the size of that tiny head that Luke has on that figure. And so it's a really good example of 2 nice head molds that they did to pour silicone to create the hard copies to use in creating the figures there. Here we have some mold pieces for the Clone Wars Clone Trooper blaster, including the hard copy piece and the Clone Trooper torso. Illustrates how every piece of the action figure was molded separately and then put back together again as a hard copy. This has got a lot of interesting stuff going on in this picture. We have an unproduced version of the Tusken Raider Galactic Hero figure holding a rifle versus the gaffy stick, which is the production one, which is also pictured there. This is the wax that was used to create the silicon mold, which is also pictured here. What's interesting about this is the mold was likely poured using a standard plastic red cup, showing how these sculptors would just kind of use whatever things they had laying around. So pictured kind of, you could see the red cup swirls on the actual mold, which is kind of neat. And on the right side, we have the silicon molds for the Taun Galactic Hero, which are more standard square molds. I wouldn't know exactly what they cast those in, but definitely more to the size of the figure. What's cool about that is the Taun Galactic Hero only had one moving part. The one arm was moving. So that was cast separately into a smaller upper mold. And then the bottom mold was the main part of the figure. And you could see the metal peg in there that they had to place so that they had room for the arm to go in there once they put it back together once they cast the resin hard copies for that one.
So then continue on with the development of the figure, the hard copy. You can have resin hard copies, SLA hard copies, which Brandon will touch on in a little bit. You can get examples that are unpainted that can be used as tooling masters, hand-painted examples that'll be paint masters for reference for the final painting, paint decos. It can also be used for photography, that type of thing. Then you have to get through the different stages of approval, presentation, photography.
Okay, so, when we see these hard copies that Don explained, they're poured out, into these silicon molds. One of the uses for these hard copies would be for making the tooling master. So the tooling master is basically a hard copy that's you'll see them pinned together. They actually use this figure to actually make the production molds in the final production process. So in this case, doesn't have any real paint application. It's just basically to really start the development process for the steel molds. And then another version of a hard copy will be painted. This really offers a 3D representation of what the paint scheme would look like. A little bit better representation of how the figures actually pin together. And notice it's a little different than a standard production action figure. I think anybody that's tried to pull one apart, a production action figure, you'll see a lot of real detailed tooling to keep that figure together. These are really designed to be pulled apart easily so they can do their paint, or whether it's a tooling or whatever change. So, and then I'll pass this on to Don.
Yeah, getting into some episode 1 love here, which seems to be getting a lot of love these days, as even Ewan was mentioning it on stage yesterday, how much more loved he is now than he was when the movie came out. Here we have the Boss Nask Paintmaster hard copy, which comes apart basically the same way it was illustrated on the previous page with the Gamorrean Guard. It's pinned together with metal pins. What's interesting about this picture is we end up with 2 Polaroid photos from the sculptor's workbench, and you can see in the picture that there's just 4 figures that are all laid out in different ways so that they could actually hand paint the pieces to put together these painted master hard copies to be used for different purposes. Some might be sent back overseas for production purposes in Hong Kong or wherever. Some could be used for toy fair displays, and others could just be used for internal presentation. Sometimes you see them show up even at these conventions that the Hasbro booths have. We've seen many hard copies there, so it's pretty cool. And then I think we're coming up to, Sebulba. Can't live without him. So he's been kind of my favorite character when I saw the movie, and I came out of it thinking, what character do I want to collect? And I fell on Sebulba. These are 4 different hard copies, which have a little bit interesting thing to each one of them. They're all for the driver of the pod racer, Sebulba hard copy. The far left one, the blue one, is interesting because they actually broke it apart on the legs, and it's a little hard to see in the photo, but the yellowish blue stuff is where they broke the legs off, the driving part of it, the feet, and repositioned them and glued them back on to just try different angles to see what might work best for them. The second one is interesting in a crazy kind of way because I don't know if the sculptor was just having fun with it or if it was actually for a purpose, but he came back to the hard copy and added wax feet to it. And you can see those feet are more like human feet that really wouldn't be any good to a Sebulba character. So I'm not sure if the sculptor was just having fun with it or if that was a legitimate thing that they were looking to try out for some reason. The third one is just a standard hard copy of the pose. And then the fourth one we have is the Paintmaster hard copy that comes apart like the other ones do with the metal pins and stuff.
So a stereolithography, also known as like an SLA, it's pretty much a hard copy phase that's used for non-organic types of creations, such as ships, accessories. In this case, Darth Vader's operating table for Revenge of the Sith. So you'll see, these things are actually created on a computer, much like the 3D printing processes are today. The only real difference is instead of using a 3D or a resin filament, you're actually using a resin that with a laser light that it builds it up layer by layer. Layer by layer. So the laser actually comes in contact with this liquid resin, and as this printing process happens, it just builds the form up. So it's really good for things that have straight edges, curves, like I said, anything non-organic.
And now we get into some of the photography stuff, which is really interesting. We have some actual kind of behind the scenes of the photography for the Epic Force Vader, where you can see like the light flashing and that they're using and that they eventually crop out for the final photos. But the second photo in the middle is really interesting because it's a backup photo of the setup for the photographer, so you can see that big old camera that they used back then and how many different things he had pasted all over the place just to get the lighting exactly right. And in there's the complete Galaxy Darth Vader, and then on the far right is the final Polaroid version of the piece that he photographed that actually got used on the packaging. So it's pretty cool how you could see the behind the scenes of how detailed that setup was for the photography there. Here we have some more complete Galaxy. On the left is the transparency for the final photograph that was used on the back of the box, and you can see the back of the box where the photo was used. And the right side's a Polaroid that has an acetate layover to it where they made handwritten markups on how they wanted the packaging to lay out there. So it's kind of cool how that, to see them, how they worked that up with the handwriting on it and stuff.
Okay, so for the final production of the figure development itself, they use these injection molding machines, as you see in the left side of the photo. And basically, these machines use like a small plastic beads that they melt down and inject into these steel molds at anywhere from 10,000 to 16,000 psi. So it's a real high pressure melted plastic, and that's essentially what you see when you hold an action figure today are these injection molded pieces, so to speak. This process has a high initial cost because of the development of the steel molds themselves, but it's really cost effective for larger runs. So that's one of the reasons why they use this. It's very durable. Here's kind of a sample of what to expect with these steel molds. This particular piece isn't really of an action figure, but it's kind of best represents the front and the back of the mold, how it goes together. And as the mold is injected with this high pressure melted plastic, it'll fill these cavities. Mold comes apart and basically releases more of a model-like representation in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. So if you ever pulled apart like plastic models, you see these little sprues, or everything's kind of connected together. So that's how the figure is actually made, and then they break the pieces off the sprues, and then it goes from there.
I went the wrong way, I think. There we go. So then we move on with the development of the production steel mold. Now you can get into making that production quality action figure, so that high pressure, high temperature injection molding, you end up with that figure. And typically they're called first shots, they can be called test shots. The terminology can vary depending on who you're talking to, but the common vernacular amongst the community would be a first shot. And a typical first shot would be a figure that would be, again, the plastic, articulated just like a production one, but it would lack the country of origin stamps, any sort of manufacturing date. I mean, LFL or Hasbro or whatever markings would be on it. Oftentimes as well, they can be different colors. Sometimes when they're making these first shots, they just use whatever plastic pellets that they have available if the machine's already loaded up, because the color at that time doesn't matter. But when you're making the final product, you want that figure to be, if the torso is going to be brown with, say, gray accents or something like that, you want to use a brown plastic because you want to do minimal amount of work in terms of the painting. So, the color of these first shots can be varied as well. But then you can also get painted, unpainted versions of those as well. And ultimately, you can create vendor samples and other examples. Here, Brandon put together an absolutely amazing photograph of production figures, ultimately, or produced figures. But these, again, are just a very good example of what different colors they could potentially use. And typically for no rhyme or reason, but if you can get find some of these figures, I mean, they can be extremely striking.
Okay, here's an example of what I call the different phases of production when you're talking about the production action figure. So generally speaking, these things can be considered vendor samples. The figure to the left is a first shot Leia Bausch. The second one next to it would be considered an engineering pilot. Sometimes you'll see pieces as they get developed, they'll have early stages of paint. So the closer they get to the final production figure, in this case, we can see that the paint scheme is much different. The tans are much more red. And they've also made some other changes as well. So the final photo to the right would be your production figure for comparison purposes. So generally speaking, when we talk about engineering pilots, we're talking more about paint sample figures that essentially are really kind of designed to just fit this line. The later samples of engineering pilots are also referred to as final engineering pilots. You'll sometimes find these painted samples on packaging. And one fun fact about this particular figure is the far left, you'll see Leia's rifle is very much like the vintage rifle that has that handle grip. Through the development process, they cut that grip off to make it look a little bit more screen accurate. So you can see the final figure actually doesn't have any type of grip. It's more of just a hold it over your shoulder, I guess, type of deal. And then as we continue to talk about these engineering pilots, one of the things you'll see that's pretty common if you're into researching or purchasing or whatever, some of these will be marked with the manufacturing plant source. So in this case, it's Hasbro Far East. So you see the little HFE written in some type of a Sharpie or pen. So this really just indicates where the figure was manufactured. It's not uncommon for Hasbro to use various manufacturing plants. And for tracking purposes, they like to mark these because they're really not designed to get out into the general public. And also just to understand which plant they're dealing with when they have to communicate any type of changes or approvals or whatnot. So like I said before, the earlier paint samples or engineering pilots will have paint differences. And then we'll show you a few different examples. So here's a Han Solo from the Beast Pack assortment. The earlier engineering pilot, you can see kind of had that red belt and holster. The shirt itself is more of a whiter white. You have a little, as it transitioned, it went to a darker belt with more of a cream-colored shirt. Emperor Palpatine, you could see it went from more of like a toned gray to more of a consistent, solid, dark gray color. And that's from the electronic power effects line from Power of the Force 2. And we have a little story about kit bashing. I'll pass that along.
Yep.
So, yeah, we're getting into my favorite stuff here. Tusken Raider has been one of my faves for a long, long time. And this is kind of an interesting little developmental story. So a lot of times when we have the Tusken Raider, Part of the Force 2, that came out with the original release, and then they came up with a Bantha and wanted to come up with a rider for the Bantha. they a lot of times like to take what they had as a figure already released, make some modifications to it, and see where they need to go just based on those modifications. So they started with this Part of the Force 2 Tusken Raider. You can see where they made slits in the cloak to try to make room for him to sit on a rider. And then the other thing they'll do a lot is they'll make cuts into the actual plastic and then glue it into an open position, which I kind of circled up there. And so that's like a starting point, and kind of sometimes it's referred to as kit bashing, where you're taking the original figure and just making some modifications to it. So in the second part of this one, they realized the cloak being plastic wasn't going to work at all, so they switched out to a soft goods cloak. And then they also realized they needed knees for the figure to sit on the bantha. They needed bending knees. So they put some bending knees on the figure and then mocked it up with they call it styrene molding plastic. So they created these styrene molding strips to do the bandages around it, and hand painted it for like a mock-up to see what it would look like with the jointed knees on it. And so that was phase 2, to kind of just see where we needed to go to get this thing so it would sit on a big bantha that they were creating, which turned out to be so cool since the vintage one, as we all know, never got made. And we get to the third phase where we have the final prototype test shot or first shot of the figure, and the final looking cape that they're using that kind of hides the legs and knees and stuff. And then we have a bagged paint sample and a loose paint sample for the figure to kind of get to the final production of what they ended up using in the final boxed version of it, which came out pretty cool.
All right, and now we'll move into the third phase. We took care of the initial images and concepts and that type of thing, the creation of the 3D figure, and now we're going to move into the packaging itself. So, the main steps for this, again, the line look. So what is it going to be based on? Is it going to be, movie related? Is it going to be an expanded thing like Power of the Jedi? How are they going to design the card backs exactly? Proof sheets, again, example of what the card back and the front, what the layout is going to look like. Proof cards, which would be basically unused card backs to provide like a real easy example, but there are some differences in those. Engineering pilot would have a figure attached to a card back in some way, shape, or form. Again, just to rough out what that's going to sort of look like. And then finally, we'll move on into the quality control samples. So once it's done, it's put together, does it sort of meet all the requirements, or does it need to go back for additional changes?
All right, so the line look, when we talk about line looks, it's really about creating just a brand image or a product or line segment image of what this product should look like among all the other related products. So you see in this case, early development of the Power of the Force 2 packaging. These are usually handmade, kind of hand cut out representation, and what they're used for really is for licensing approval or licensor approval, to make sure that they get the approval they need with, in this case, Lucasfilm. And the second version of this would be more of like a transitional phase as it gets closer to the final design. And the third piece here is your final package design. Fun fact about this particular line look, it was developed with what they call a concept Luke Skywalker. It's a very early sculpt, very similar to the production figure that we see. It does obviously have some paint differences, but the sculpting is completely different, but very similar. So it's kind of an interesting piece. Here's another example of the developmental change from beginning to end for Power of the Jedi. So the first representation is a handmade, hand-drawn, printed kind of mock-up. Second one's actually a mock-up figure that has essentially it's hand-printed cardboard to make the back of the figure itself. They just take a production figure and a production ComTech chip. So just to give kind of a 3D feel of what this figure line would look like. Ultimately, what we see is the Power of the Jedi to the far right. That's the final production packaging design. So you can see how the images change from beginning to end, from concept to production. I think it's a pretty interesting way when it goes through this process. Here's an example of for a group of figures or line segment known as the Millennium Minted Coins. I think a lot of people have seen these coins. Are very popular for a lot of collectors in terms of modern and vintage. In this case, it started off as a handmade mock-up. This card back is actually hand printed, designed on a computer, hand printed. The coin itself is made out of cardboard, so it's just printed cardboard. They attach a Luke figure just for internal discussions. Again, licensor approval. Final design is the picture to the right. We've got an open window box design. So it kind of shows you the beginning to end transition.
Here we have an interesting thing. A lot of times in the process of creating these action figures, they need a final product for various reasons. Sometimes it's toy fair, or sometimes to show to vendors in advance, and they don't actually have the action figure ready yet. So they kind of use this trick of the eye, and sometimes these are called foam core mock-ups because they use foam core a lot. In this particular one, it's a 12-inch electronic Darth Maul, and it's just a paper cutout glued on of the action figure, but looking straight on into the packaging, it gives the appearance that it's an actual action figure if you had it like on a wall at Toy Fair or something like that. So it's really cool how the whole box is handmade, and then I tried to get a picture of the side view so you could see that it's just a piece of cardboard with the picture on it that's glued into the box for the presentation of that. So it's kind of an interesting thing that they'll do when the actual action figure isn't ready yet, and they need something to show people what it's going to look like.
So here's some other examples of 2D printed action figures. None of the figures used here are actual figures. They're all, again, handmade cutouts attached to either the card back itself, very similarly to what we saw in the previous slide. First one's kind of a mock-up for the freeze frame product line. And then we have 3 other examples. The far right was the 30th anniversary line. This figure I don't believe was ever released on this card back, but it's not uncommon for them to use designs to get that overall line look that we talked about. Now, early proofing designs, people might, if you're a vintage collector, you've heard of chromalins. Here's an example of more of a modern chromalin. Chromalins are considered a real early proofing process. Basically, you'll see the picture to the right. This particular one has an acetate overlay, sometimes used to mark changes and whatnot. But it's really used for more of the old style CMYK pressing process. So what they do is they use this to check the colors for the card back, sometimes the registration marks to make sure everything lines up properly. If any of the colors are printed offset, you'll see kind of a blurring effect with these. So
here we have a printer's proof for the, and don't try to say this 3 times fast, the Roar War Wookiee that was included in it was a game that came out, you may remember or not, it's called Invasion of Theed game. And inside this game was an actual carded Wookiee, the Roar War that you see here, and there on the left is the printer's proof for that figure. And then just for a little eye candy, that's the hard copy of the figure itself. And then on the right, we have the Power of the Jedi, and it's just another one of my faves, it's the proof for the 12-inch Forlom figure, What's interesting is how big these can get. That's 24 inches wide by 32 inches long for that proof. So, it can come into some costly framing costs when you go to try to find wall space for these things and stuff. On this next page is interesting. This is also from part of the Jedi line. These are the force file things that were folded up and put into the action figure. On the right is the proof sheet for the battle droid security figure. What's interesting about this slide is stapled to that, and you can see on the proof itself it says second copy or second proof. On the left is interesting because you don't often get a view of the actual Lucas licensing approval sheet where it describes the piece in detail, and then at the bottom right corner you can see where it's checked off as approved, and that was so that ended up being the final approval for that proof, which is kind of cool to see that internal process there.
Yep, and then moving on to proof cards. This is, again, terminology that the collectors have established over time. As Brandon showed a few slides ago with that, the Stormtrooper, the chromalin, in the printing world, that's considered the true proof, printer's proof. They look for the flaws, the details in the imaging. And this proof card, as we call it these days, would be essentially, like I said, a simplified version is just an unused card back. But there also can be other subtle differences as well. Sometimes these cards, generally they have no markings of any kind. So if there's like a plastic hanger support that goes with the figure, if there's, once the figure is produced and it's ready to go out, a date stamp will be applied to the figure. So these cards are essentially, never had a bubble attached. Generally, they don't have any the plastic hanger, and they won't have any stamps or any marks of any kind. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, that's the general rule. Ultimately, with any of these pieces, whether it's 2D or 3D pieces throughout this entire process, the source of the material becomes very important. I mean, provenance is key with these things. Because there have been known to be fakes of all types of different pieces, both vintage and modern. So again, keeping track of where these things come from is incredibly important. The example here, more proof cards from some of the different lines. Again, nothing too unique about any of these things. Again, for the most part, they just look like unused card backs. Here we get into some very interesting pieces. Again, random cardstock. It can be a first shot figure, it could be a hard copy figure that's painted. Anything to mock up the figure to show what it looks like. And these would generally be considered mock-ups, but some people refer to them as engineering pilots too. Again, one maybe sort of key takeaway with a lot of this presentation is really not to get hung up on a specific vernacular. Again, if someone's calling one of the loose action figures, the first shot's a test shot. Again, if it's got dates or not, is it still a first shot? If it's multicolored or not, is it a first shot? Again, a lot of times it's describing what it is. As collectors, we really try to categorize things, got to put it in a specific box. But, again, for the purposes of this presentation, we just want to provide that high-level overview. Again, more examples here. And some of these are, extremely interesting because, there is obviously no relation to Splat or the racers or anything like that for these cards. But, I mean, they really provide, absolutely amazing visuals of what they go through. And they're just looking for the cut of the card, how the bubble will fit, and, ultimately how the figure even hangs on the tab. Here's, a couple more great ones as well. To the left, this is a card back from the Expanded Universe. And that card back, if any of you remember, it was very thick. And the purpose of that is that it essentially unfolded to create a little bit of a diorama. So, here we have, a completely random paper example of that. So.
Okay, so as we get closer to final production, you'll see quality control samples. So since many of these figures are actually produced overseas at the manufacturing plants, Hasbro, Kenner, they send these figures back and forth to communicate any type of changes or make approvals for the figure. So here's an example of an R5D4 where they made a color change to both the trigger and the projectile. So this was a change that they sent. They basically write these their notes, the desired changes on this green card, this green Kenner standard card, and then it goes back to the factory. The factory makes the changes. They send it back and forth. Another change on this particular figure is they wanted to make the red paint a little bit more matte, less glossy. So again, everything goes through an approval process. This is the final process before things actually get released for production. And then after it's approved, figures they just go into production, go to distribution warehouses, eventually wind up in our stores or in your mailbox these days.
Yep, and then that basically concludes the sort of the main three key areas of the design and production of the figure. And what we have now is about 10 or 11 slides that have been put together that illustrate a number of unproduced figures or toys. These would have been just in the early concept stages, things that they tried that just never made it past that their early approval stage. So,
yeah, so as a figure is developed, there's many reasons why action figures will get canceled or maybe sometimes the concepts get changed. One of the main reasons, or one of the reasons, would be the licensor approval. If Lucasfilm says, hey, we don't want to do this, or I don't like this idea, concept, you'll see maybe a concept change, or maybe the figure gets canceled. The second would be manufacturing costs. Throughout the years, there have been changes, such as the Comtech chip. Due to the high costs of making those chips, it just didn't make sense to continue the production of them. Next would be the retailer buy-in. So it's important that these major retailers buy into the products that are released. So the toy fairs that you see, they're used to kind of entice retailers, these big box retailers, to buy the products. And then last would be just low overall demand. If a product's released, sometimes the sales were just not enough for them to continue the product. Even though some of these products went pretty far in the development stage, they'll still cancel them. So we'll give you some examples of what some of these concepts look like. So in this picture, these are what we call the gunner stations from 1997. I think some of you probably remember that line. Some of the part of the Force 2. So basically, this line was canceled after the first stage. On the left, you'll see Death Star gunner station, where it had a very similar figure except articulated knees. Then we have the B-wing fighter gunner station, and then last, the X-wing fighter gunner station. This was originally going to include a Wedge Antilles action figure, which was later released in the Millennium Falcon carry case. Next, we have some electronic power effects concepts. Those were the figures that had like light-up lightsabers, had batteries back in the back of the action figure. So here's an example of a Stormtrooper, Chewbacca, and Princess Leia. This line was also canceled after the first wave. Leading into some more concepts related to that, there was a trash compactor that was designed for this assortment. And I'm going to blow through this pretty quick because we're running out of time here.
Here we have an interesting find that showed up out of nowhere. This is a part of the Force 2 Stormtrooper figure that noticed something weird with it, and it was something drilled in the back of its head, and I caught the light to it and looked inside. It was actually a trash compactor scene in there, like a view slider thing. So they had the thought at some point to drill this out and make it like a viewfinder with a scene in there. So a super cool concept. Never got made, of course. Go to the next one. And Now we got my favorite, which we have no time to talk about, but the plush. I met a bunch of you guys in line and handed out some buttons that featured my EOP plush on there. These would have been released with episode 1. They're about half the size of the original Buddies lines. And these figures, unfortunately, never got produced, but there's some cool figures that they would have made, including the EOP and the OP fish monster figure. And Dewback is one of my favorites, too. And the mini Stormy Invader, super cool.
Okay, so after the final lightsaber duel was released, there were 2 other 2-pack sets, both to have a Qui-Gon Jinn and a battle droid. Also, a Gungan set with destroyer droid. So it gives you a quick representation of what that looked like. Also, there was, for part of the Beast assortment that we saw with the EOP and Qui-Gon, there was also supposed to be a Sketo Beast with an Obi-Wan Kenobi. This was featured in the 2000 pre-Toy Fair catalog. Second wave of unproduced Comtech chips. A lot of people may have seen these floating around. This concept was canceled due to the cost, as I had mentioned. These figures were later released on Power of the Jedi. Then here's a concept that they played around with, the Flock Chewbacca. It started back in 1995. They continued this look back throughout the Power of the Jedi era. So here's some examples of that flocking. G.I. Joe fans out there probably recognize this from the 1960s and 1970s action figures where they had the flocking on the head, the 12-inch figures, of course. And then, of course, there was a Dexter Jetster that was supposed to be released with a pipe. Early of the packaging samples indicated this. It was later changed, and this was ultimately rejected by Lucasfilm just due to the promotion of tobacco products. And then last we have a final wave of 30th anniversary toys with the cool cardback design. There were 8 more figures supposed to be released. The retailers chose not to continue to purchase these figures, so ultimately the figures were held out and released in the Legacy collection. And they still retain some of the artwork, as you can see in the packaging insert.
Well, that's it. Wraps things up. Thank you very much for attending. We'll be down in the collector social room if anybody wants to come down and chat some more. So thanks. Have a great celebration, everybody.